Well, Belarus blinked. But if you think that this is over, trust me, it's not. Actually, no, don't trust me. Let me explain. What I'm referring to, of course, is Zelensky's ultimatum to Belarus from last week. Quit assisting Russia with its drone assaults on Ukraine, or we will physically stop you from helping. Ukraine's president was kind enough to offer 7 days for a response, perhaps completely perplexed that it was not a 2-week deadline. Lukashenko was even kinder and answered in only 3 days, though we just learned about the situation yesterday. The systems that Russia was using are now off, though whether they are off or just off may prolong the drama. And so what I want to do today is cover some more details of what was happening beforehand, explain the tactical change Russia has made in the last few days, and discuss why the apparent reduction in attacks that Ukraine has enjoyed for those days will not be the long-run effect of the Belarusian blink. Then I will pivot to how Russian compliance will depend on what Ukraine does next, and why we are not out of the woods regarding active hostilities between Ukraine and Belarus. But let me start with the big change. Here was the typical Russian strategy as of a few weeks ago. Russia operates at least 5 standard airfields east of Belarus that regularly launch Shahed drones. Those drones then hug the border between Ukraine and Belarus, both for protection from Ukrainian defenses and for signals guidance. They then make sharp left turns and head for their ultimate targets. Let me rattle off some general numbers to give you an idea of the scale of the overall problem, noting that we do not have public data on the specific problem at hand. In 2025, Russia launched about 55,000 Shahed-style drones at Ukraine, roughly 32,000 of which were actual strike drones, as opposed to decoys. In the absence of yearly totals specifically for Kyiv, I can tell you that the busiest day of the year saw between 300 and 500 drones aimed at the city. But note that for the current problem, drones can attack from multiple directions, and that Russia also strikes cities other than Kyiv. So it is very hard to put a precise number on how many drones Belarus assists with, and best to just describe it as a problem more generally. Belarus's own figures indicate that there were 1,400 airspace violations for the year, and 520 drones crashed within Belarusian borders. However, I would treat these statistics as the floor of the true numbers. Higher numbers make the government look weak and unable to regulate their own airspace. Hence, there is an incentive to underreport the actual extent of the problem. As for some more tactical details, Russia has attached repeaters to standard cell towers inside of Belarus. These are essentially communication devices that ensure that Russian Shaheds are going in the correct direction. They can also help the drones recover from Ukrainian jamming efforts if it comes to that. Well, the big news from yesterday is that those repeaters were no longer operating. Now, what that precisely means is unclear. It is possible that Russia simply flipped a switch off, and so they are no longer broadcasting. It is also possible that Russia dismantled them or is in the process of doing so. Either way, the short-run effect is transparent. There have been no mass Shahed attacks along the border in recent days. To speculate on what has happened behind the scenes, Belarus internalized the growing threat of Ukraine's mid-range drones and concluded that the likelihood of kinetic action against Belarus was too high. The interesting thing here is that Lukashenko apparently convinced Putin to go along with it. As of a few days ago, it was unclear whether the Kremlin would strong-arm its Union state partner into forcing Ukraine to put up or shut up. One interpretation here is that Russia simply does not have the bargaining power vis-a-vis Belarus to force its preferred policy. It is also possible that the Kremlin is worried about the stability of the Minsk government, and any further instability that Ukrainian attacks might cause was not in either half of the Union state's best interest. Certainly there will be skepticism that Belarus/Russia intends to continue to comply in the long run. That is indeed the interpretation of the Belarusian opposition, which was contemporaneously releasing a report that Lukashenko was preparing to enter the war. To be clear, that may very well be the case, though, for what it is worth, the Kremlin denies that there is any pressure on Belarus to participate. But we need to be careful here because the incentives are for the opposition to make the government look completely unreasonable, as opposed to just mostly unreasonable. All the report itself indicates is that Belarus has increased defense spending and recruitment of soldiers, which are not unsurprising measures when you have a huge war on your border, and Ukraine not too long ago showed that it had the ability to invade Kursk. There is nothing here that is imminent, like what the Biden administration sounded alarm bells over before the invasion began. So, again, this remains a possible concern, but the report is not something that ought to much move your opinion. Back to focusing on the repeaters. I mentioned a moment ago that the sudden drop in drone attacks through that northern corridor would not last. Let me explain what I mean in broad strokes. Suppose that the repeaters are just shut off. Well, the proximate effect, for now, is that the northern attack route just became notably more difficult for Russia to navigate. Okay, if you think about how Ukraine should have allocated its defenses beforehand, the goal is to level its vulnerability on all fronts, lest Russia take advantage of a particular weakness. Thus, if you hold Ukrainian defenses constant and suddenly make one particular pathway more difficult, Russia's response to the situation is to just reallocate its attacks elsewhere. That, in turn, renders irrelevant all of the Ukrainian defenses up north. Not in the sense that they have been destroyed, but rather in the sense that they are not ultimately used. Some of those defenses therefore need to be rerouted to other attack vectors to make everything even out again. So the long-run baseline equilibrium effect is for Ukraine to feel the relief everywhere else as well, and for Kyiv to feel the same level of relief as those places. Consequently, if you are living in Kyiv, breathe a bit lighter, but do not believe that suddenly everything will now be easy. What is missing from this conversation, both in the general media and my own thus far, is how Belarusian/Russian compliance will depend on what Ukraine does next, and that also depends on what the exact status of the repeaters is. The easier case is if the repeaters have been dismantled. Then, presumably, Ukraine will also be able to notice if Russia tries to reconstruct them. If so, Ukraine can more or less ignore them in developing its new defensive posture, just needing to remain cognizant that there may need to be rapid changes if intelligence detects Russia reverting the repeaters. The harder case is if Belarus flipped a literal switch to turn them off. Then the next time that Russia plans an attack, it broadly has three options. 1. Attack elsewhere. 2. Attack the northern route without the repeaters. And 3. Attack the northern route with the repeaters turned back on. The deterrent to the third option is that Russia will pay some sort of cost by upsetting Belarus if it does that. Now, it is possible that upsetting Belarus would not be worth it regardless of Ukraine's defensive allocation. Better to attack along the northern route without the repeaters if that is the direction that Russia wants to go. In that case, the dilemma returns to the standard defensive allocation problem. Calculating whether that is indeed the case is no simple task. None of us on this side of the fog of war have a good feel for it, and I am sure that this is a topic of discussion inside of Ukraine right now. In contrast, if Russia would consider attacking the northern route, then Ukraine intuitively needs to keep more protection in that area compared to the previous case. However, Ukraine ought to allocate less effort to the region the costlier it is for Russia to anger Belarus. This is because Russia finds the other targets look comparatively more attractive, thereby necessitating Ukraine to protect those areas. Where we ultimately see the attack, and whether the repeaters ultimately stay silent, depends on whether the northern area is particularly vulnerable on a given night. Obviously, this second case is worse for Ukraine, because it now must factor in the possibility that Russia could use the stronger offensive capability. And that takes us to the final point for today. The drama with the repeaters is not yet over. To be clear, I am not just talking about how Ukraine may reallocate its defenses to the point that Russia may want to switch them back on, though that would indeed cause further drama. Rather, the problem is that Ukraine still might not find the current situation acceptable, if the repeaters have indeed been turned off rather than destroyed. Bear in mind that Zelensky's initial statement on the subject was rather coy, so I suspect that this is presently the topic of conversation inside of the strategy room. Same thing for the folks in intelligence. To get ahead of the topic, think about the difference in quality of outcomes for Kyiv when it knows that the repeaters are gone, versus when it has to keep Russia honest and not simply turn them back on? Well, there is another option here. Ukraine could deny Russia the opportunity to flip a switch by simply destroying the infrastructure associated with the repeaters. The cost is that doing so requires striking Belarusian soil, raising concerns that Lukashenko might respond by doubling down on his support to Russia. You can see how the framing of this would work. Belarus was being the reasonable actor, hearing Ukraine's concern, and convincing Moscow to shut them off. Yet Kyiv decided to attack anyway. And note that the strikes were on Belarusian cell towers, conceivably also used as civilian infrastructure. So despite Minsk's best efforts to stay out of the war, Kyiv has left its neighbor with no other alternative. Of course, that is just one direction that this can go. Only a few days ago, we were discussing the possibility that Lukashenko is much more worried about the situation and would not want to fight back if Ukraine limited its strikes to military targets. You will remember that Zelensky had also threatened to strike Belarusian refineries, something that we have appeared to move on from for now. If this is the case, then the coercion campaign has only changed slightly compared to where we were last week. Ukraine is likely to make another threat to Belarus, repeating that the repeaters need to be removed, not simply turned off. Belarus will then have to make a fateful decision. The only difference is that we now know that Lukashenko was willing to propose the current situation as a compromise. In case it was not abundantly clear already, this entire war is a mess, and it does not seem like it will be getting any better anytime soon. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? Belarus blinked, taking the repeater stations that guide Russian drones offline. The folks in Kyiv have felt immediate relief from drone attacks, though the long-run effect will be lesser relief for Kyiv, with instead the benefits to all areas that could come under attack. Whether Belarus/Russia will comply with the tacit agreement depends on how exactly Ukraine will reorient its defenses, which is also subject to a tricky calculation for Ukraine. There is an alternative, though. Ukraine strikes the repeaters anyway. But whether that happens will be subject to another round of negotiations. Meanwhile, subject to another round of negotiations sounds like something that could appear in every chapter of one of these two excellent books about the start of the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.